The late afternoon sun sagged low over the Wyoming plains, gilding the grass in pale golden shadow. Wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Along the narrow trail, Clara Jennings walked beside a limping colt, ribs showing, coat matted, breath shallow. The poor thing stumbled every few yards, and each time it did, Clara whispered softly, "Easy now. Just a little farther." She had been on the move for 3 days. Her boots were torn, her dress hem caked with mud, and the once fine leather satchel slung over her shoulder hung nearly empty, save for a crumpled letter she could not bear to throw away. It was a letter from a man she had once trusted, a promise of love and partnership that had turned into betrayal. She had lost her family's small ranch because of that lie, and with nowhere else to go, she had wandered west looking for work, or perhaps redemption. When she'd found the dying colt abandoned by a creek bed, Clara hadn't thought twice. The animal's eyes had been dull with pain, and something in her heart had cracked open. She had knelt beside it, offering water from her canteen and whispering words she wished someone had once said to her, "You're not alone. Not while I'm here." Now, as dusk deepened into purple, Clara reached the edge of Hollow Ridge Valley, a quiet stretch of land she'd heard belonged to a reclusive rancher. The place looked half wild, half kept, as though someone cared for it but preferred solitude to company. She knew she couldn't go much farther. The colt's legs trembled, and her own body screamed for rest. She spotted an old barn in the distance, its roof sagging slightly but still standing strong against the wind. Clara hesitated. She didn't want to trespass. Not again, not after losing everything because of someone else's property and promises. But when the colt collapsed to its knees with a pitiful whinny, her decision was made. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and leather greeted her like a ghost of better days. She found an old blanket hanging from a nail and spread it over the animal. From her satchel she pulled the last of her oats, meant for her, not the colt, and poured them into her palm, coaxing him to eat. The creature's eyes fluttered weakly, and Clara brushed his mane with trembling fingers. "You've got more fight in you than I do," she murmured. "If you can stand by morning, maybe we'll both have a chance." Her voice echoed softly through the empty barn. Outside, thunder rolled, and distant but coming closer. She sat on a hay bale, wrapping her arms around herself. The weight of loneliness pressed down, heavier than the storm. She thought of her father's ranch, of the warm kitchen where she used to hum while baking bread, of the letter's fine handwriting that had promised forever and stolen everything instead. Then, through the rising wind, Clara heard something, the creak of a door, the soft step of boots on wooden planks. Her breath caught. In the barn doorway stood a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, his face shadowed but his posture calm, steady. A cowboy, though not like the ones from town who stared too long or spoke too rough. This one said nothing for a long moment, just watched, her, the colt, the faint flicker of the lantern she'd lit. "You lost?" he asked finally, his voice low and even. Clara swallowed hard. "No, sir, just trying to save what's left." He looked at the colt, then back at her, and though his expression didn't change, something in his eyes softened. "Barn's dry," he said after a pause. "You can stay till the storm passes." Clara nodded, unable to speak. The thunder cracked overhead as the man turned away, his boots echoing in the night. She didn't know his name yet. Didn't know he was the one who would mend both her heart and the colt's. But as rain began to fall, and the little horse breathed easier beside her, Clara felt the first fragile spark of hope. A beginning. The storm broke over Hollow Ridge Ranch like a wild beast, drumming on the roof and rattling the shutters. Lightning flashed across the hills, briefly illuminating Luke McAllister as he watched from the porch, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose calm eyes had seen too much loss to be easily shaken. He'd lived alone for nearly 5 years now, ever since his wife, Mary, passed from fever one cruel winter. Since then, the house had been silent except for the wind and the soft creak of saddle leather. Luke had grown used to solitude. It was easier that way. People meant conversation, expectation, pain, cattle, fences, and sky, those he could manage. They didn't ask questions or look at him with pity. But earlier that evening, while checking the southern fence before the storm hit, he'd seen something strange. A woman leading a half-dead colt along the creek bed. She'd been small and thin, with her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked and torn. There had been a look in her eyes that caught him off guard, something stubborn and scared all at once. He'd followed her tracks back to his barn and found her kneeling beside the colt, whispering to it like a mother would to a fevered child. She hadn't begged or cried or asked for anything, just fought quietly to keep that creature alive. Now, as the rain hammered down, Luke pulled off his hat and stepped inside. The barn was dim, the air warm with the scent of hay and damp leather. The woman looked up when he entered, startled but not afraid. The colt lifted its head weakly at the sound of his boots. "You can stay till the storm's done," he repeated, hanging his hat on a nail. "Ain't right to leave any living thing out in weather like this." "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low and hoarse. "We won't be any trouble." Luke nodded once. "That colt's in rough shape." "I know." Her eyes softened as she stroked the animal's neck. "But he's still breathing. Sometimes that's enough." He studied her for a moment, noting the set of her shoulders, the grit in her tone. Most folks would have given up on a half-starved horse, or on themselves, long before now. Something about her stirred a faint echo of admiration in his chest, one he quickly pushed down. "Got feed in that bin," he said finally. "Take what you need." As he turned to go, she called after him. "You're kind to help a stranger." Luke paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Ain't kindness, just sense. You and that colt both look like you could use a dry night and a little feed." Then he left her there, the sound of his boots fading into the rain. Later, in the quiet of his cabin, Luke poured himself a cup of coffee and stared into the fire. He told himself it didn't matter. She'd be gone by morning, same as the storm. Still, he found his thoughts drifting to the barn, to the woman's determined hands, her quiet voice, the way she'd kept talking to that dying colt as if words alone might keep it tethered to life. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Mist curled low over the hills and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. Luke walked out to the barn expecting to find it empty. Instead, he saw her still there, her hair in wild tangles, her eyes bright with exhaustion and hope. The colt stood, unsteady but upright, its head resting against her arm. "He's up," she whispered, smiling for the first time. Luke nodded slowly. Guess he decided he's not done yet. Their eyes met then, his steady, hers shining, and for the first time in years, something stirred in the quiet places of his heart. He didn't know her story or why she carried sorrow like a shadow, but he knew this much. Anyone who could bring a broken colt back from the edge had a fire worth keeping close. And for the first time in a long while, Luke McAllister didn't feel entirely alone. Morning came bright and golden over Hollow Ridge Ranch, the world washed clean after the storm. Puddles sparkled in the yard and the air held that sweet damp scent that comes only after rain. From the open barn doors, Clara watched sunlight fall across the valley like a blessing. The colt, whom she had begun to call Chance, stood steady now, chewing contentedly on a flake of hay. His coat still showed the roughness of neglect, but his eyes had life again. When he nickered softly at her touch, Clara smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in what felt like years. Behind her, the sound of footsteps drew her attention. Luke McAllister appeared at the doorway, a bucket in one hand and a clean bandage roll in the other. He nodded toward the colt. "He's looking better than I expected. You must have worked all night." Clara brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "He wanted to live. I just helped him along." Luke set the bucket down and crouched beside the colt, his movements careful and practiced. "Still favoring that left leg. Might have strained it trying to stand too early." She watched as he examined the limb with quiet patience. He didn't talk much, but there was something gentle about the way his big, calloused hands moved, firm enough to mend fences, soft enough not to frighten a skittish animal. When he finished, he rose and looked at her. "You got a place to go?" Clara hesitated. "No," she admitted finally. "Not anymore. I was headed west, but I suppose I didn't plan much past keeping him alive." Luke nodded as though he'd already guessed. "I can use help around the place," he said simply. "Ain't fancy work, but it's steady. You stay in the loft, tend the horses, help with the chores. We'll call it square." The offer caught her off guard. She studied him, his weathered face, his steady gaze. He didn't seem the sort to offer charity, and there was no pity in his tone. Just straightforward practicality. "I'll earn my keep," she said firmly. "That's the idea." He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Breakfast on the stove. Eat before you fall over." Clara blinked at his retreating figure, half smiling despite herself. For years she had been spoken to and told what to do, how to behave, what to believe. But Luke McAllister spoke with her, as if she were someone who still had a place in the world. By midday, the two of them worked side by side in the pastures, mending fence lines and checking the water troughs. Luke was a man of few words, but when he did speak, his voice held the calm steadiness of someone who understood both silence and sorrow. Between chores, he showed her how to read the clouds to predict a storm, how to test a fence wire for weakness, how to judge a horse's strength by the set of its ears. She learned quickly, grateful for something to keep her hands and thoughts busy. As the sun dipped low, Clara returned to the barn to check on Chance. Luke followed quietly, leaning against the doorpost as she brushed the colt's coat. "He's getting stronger," she said softly. Luke nodded. "So are you." The words caught her off guard. No one had ever said that to her before. For a moment, the air felt thick between them, not with tension but with understanding. She turned away, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. "I don't know about that." He shrugged, his voice low. "Takes strength to keep something alive that everyone else gave up on." When she looked back, his gaze was steady, kind, and strangely unreadable. In that quiet barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the soft sound of the colt's breathing, Clara realized that Hollow Ridge wasn't just a refuge. It was becoming a place where she might finally start to heal. And though Luke McAllister didn't say much more that night, his presence, steady as the sunrise, told her everything words could not. Autumn crept quietly into Hollow Ridge Valley, painting the cottonwoods gold and rust. Weeks had passed since the storm, and in that time, life had found a slow, steady rhythm. Clara rose with the dawn, milked the cows, and tended to Chance, whose coat now gleamed in the morning light. Luke handled the ranch work, hauling feed, checking fences, breaking a new mare. They didn't talk much during the day, but there was comfort in their silence. At supper, they'd share stories in fragments, pieces of a past neither was ready to fully expose. Still, a fragile trust had formed between them, something unspoken yet steady as the fence lines they mended together. Then, one late afternoon, that peace was broken. The mail wagon came rattling down the dirt road, dust swirling behind it. Luke waved the driver down for his usual supply bill and newspaper. But when he sorted through the stack of envelopes, one bore Clara's name, her full name written in the elegant hand she knew too well. Her fingers froze. The sight of that writing made her heart lurch painfully. Luke noticed the change in her face. "You expecting something?" She shook her head too quickly. "No, not from anyone who'd write." He didn't pry, just handed her the letter and returned to unloading supplies. Clara stood there in the yard, staring at the paper as though it were a snake ready to strike. That night, long after the dishes were washed and Luke had retreated to his cabin, she sat by the lantern in the barn and opened it. "Clara, I've been trying to find you. You left before I could explain. You still have something of mine. The deed to your father's land. We could set things right, start again. Come back and I'll make it worth your while." Nathan, her hands trembled. Nathan Hale. The name she had once spoken with love now felt like a bruise on her tongue. He was the man who had courted her with sweet words, promising partnership, only to swindle her out of her inheritance when her father died. The deed he mentioned, tucked deep in her satchel, had been the only proof she hadn't signed everything away. Clara crumpled the letter, heart pounding. She had built a fragile peace here, a life that wasn't dictated by deceit or shame. She couldn't let that man find her again, but secrets have a way of seeping through cracks, and Luke McAllister was not a man easily fooled. When he came by the barn early the next morning, he found her feeding the colt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Didn't sleep much," he said quietly. "No." She didn't turn around. "Just thinking." He studied her for a moment, then said, "That letter. Whoever sent it, he's the reason you ended up out here, isn't he?" Clara's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to hold her shame close where no one could see. But Luke's tone wasn't accusing, just steady, patient. "Yes," she said finally. "He has took everything, my father's land, my savings, my reputation. When folks found out, they thought I'd been part of it. So I left." Luke leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. "You didn't run. You survived. There's a difference." She looked at him then, eyes glistening. "You don't know what it's like to be tricked by someone you loved?" His jaw tightened. "No." but I know what it's like to lose someone and think you'll never stand again." Their eyes met, two souls haunted by loss, finding understanding in the ruins. Still, the unease didn't fade. Clara tucked the letter deep into her satchel, but the words clung to her mind like burrs. She could almost feel Nathan's shadow stretching across the valley. That evening, as the wind picked up and clouds gathered over the ridge, Luke noticed her standing at the fence line, staring toward the distant road. "Something's coming," he said softly, following her gaze. "Yes," she whispered, "I can feel it." And though neither said it aloud, both knew the storm ahead wouldn't come from the sky this time, but from the past that refused to stay buried. The wind came first, low and restless, curling through the valley like a warning. The sky turned a bruised gray, heavy with rain. Out on Hollow Ridge, even the horses grew uneasy, stamping and snorting at the scent of the coming storm. Luke McAllister stood on the porch, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. He'd seen plenty of weather in his time, but something about this one felt different. Wild, unpredictable, the kind that tested both man and land. He turned toward the barn where Clara was brushing down Chance, the Colt's sleek coat glinting in the half-light. "Storm's rolling in fast," he called over the wind. "We'll need to get the herd to higher ground." Clara looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. "Can I help?" "You can keep the Colt inside and the gates shut tight. This one'll hit hard." She nodded, but as Luke saddled his horse, she caught the tension in his shoulders, the same quiet strain she'd seen only once before, when he'd spoken of his late wife. Something about facing the storm alone weighed on him, and it tugged at her heart. By dusk, the sky cracked open. Rain lashed the earth and thunder rolled like cannon fire. Luke and his ranch hand, old Ben, rode through sheets of rain, driving the cattle toward the upper ridge. The wind howled across the plains, sharp as broken glass. Back at the barn, Clara lit a lantern and tried to stay calm. Chance paced restlessly, his eyes wide and white in the dim light. The wind rattled the doors, the rain hammering louder and louder. When a bolt of lightning split the sky overhead, the Colt spooked violently, kicking free of the stall latch. "Chance, no!" Clara cried, running after him. He bolted out into the storm, his dark shape disappearing into the downpour. Without thinking, Clara threw on her coat, grabbed the lantern, and plunged into the night. The rain was cold and blinding. Mud sucked at her boots as she stumbled through the pasture, calling the Colt's name again and again. Her voice was lost to the wind. Lightning flashed, revealing a blur of movement ahead, the Colt slipping near the edge of the creek bed. "Easy, boy," she shouted, holding the lantern high. "It's me." Chance turned at her voice, but the ground beneath them was slick. Clara took one step closer, and the earth gave way. She fell with a sharp cry, tumbling down the embankment. Pain shot through her arm as she hit the muddy ground. Through the roar of the storm, she heard hooves. Another horse, heavier this time. A familiar voice cut through the thunder. "Clara!" It was Luke. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, sliding down the slope toward her. The lantern had gone out, leaving only the flash of lightning and the pounding of rain. He found her half buried in mud, clutching her arm. "Are you hurt?" I think it's just twisted," she gasped. "Chance!" He ran. Luke turned and saw the Colt standing a few yards away, trembling but unhurt. The animal had stopped running the moment he'd heard Clara's voice again. "You've both got more stubbornness than sense," Luke muttered, relief softening his tone. He helped her to her feet, his hands steady and warm despite the cold. "You shouldn't have come out here alone." "I couldn't just let him die," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "That's what scares me." For a moment, neither moved. The storm raging around them, the world reduced to rain, mud, and the sound of their hearts. Then Luke lifted her into his arms, carrying her back toward the ranch. By the time they reached the barn, both were soaked to the bone. He set her down gently near the fire pit, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The Colt stood nearby, calm now, as if understanding the danger had passed. Luke crouched in front of her, rain dripping from his hair. "You could have been killed," he said, voice low. "So could you," she shot back softly. Then, after a pause, "But we're both still here." Something passed between them in that silence. Something deep and unspoken, like a truth neither dared to name. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the barn, where a woman, a cowboy, and a once broken Colt huddled together by firelight, there was warmth, fragile, real, and growing stronger with every breath. The storm roared through the night, hammering against the barn roof like 1,000 fists. Inside, the flickering lantern light cast long, trembling shadows across the wooden walls. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket near the small fire Luke had built in the old stone pit. Her arm was bound with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt, rough but secure. The heat from the fire seeped slowly into her chilled bones, and though her body ached, it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was the closeness. Luke sitting just across from her, silent and watchful, the firelight catching the angles of his face. He looked different in the light, softer but still strong. His blue-gray eyes reflected both warmth and sorrow, like a man who'd spent too many nights talking only to ghosts. Clara broke the silence first. "You didn't have to come after me." Luke looked up, his voice quiet but steady. "Didn't have a choice. Couldn't let you face that storm alone." She smiled faintly, though her hands trembled as she reached toward the fire. "Seems I've got a habit of chasing trouble. Guess you've got one of catching me." That earned her a ghost of a smile, small but real. "Reckon that's true." For a long moment they just listened, to the fire crackling, to the rain easing from a roar to a whisper. Chance the Colt lay nearby, finally resting after the long night. The quiet settled around them, comfortable and heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Luke spoke again. "When you talked about that man, the one who took your land, I could tell it still haunts you." Clara stared into the flames. "It does. I keep telling myself I've left it behind, but part of me is still back there, standing in that empty house wondering how I could have been so blind." "Trusting someone isn't blindness," Luke said gently. "It's just hope in the wrong hands." She looked up at him then, startled by the understanding in his voice. "You sound like you know what that feels like." He nodded slowly. "I do. My wife, Mary, she died 5 years ago. Fever took her before the doctor could make it through the pass. After she was gone, I tried to fill the silence with work, but nothing ever stuck. Just made the quiet louder." The honesty in his tone undid her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Luke shook his head. "Don't be. She was the best part of me, and losing her near broke the rest. Took a long time to figure out how to breathe again." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "And now you live alone out here, mending fences and nursing strays like me." He gave a soft laugh. Low, rough, almost tender. "Reckon I do. But some things aren't meant to stay broken." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither dared to name. The fire popped, sending a spark spiraling upward. Clara reached out without thinking and laid her hand over his. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust again," she said quietly. "Not with land, not with people." His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, not possessive, just steady. "Then don't, not yet. Just rest, heal. Let life come back slow like the Colt." Clara swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what about you? You healed, Luke?" He looked into the fire for a long time before answering. "Not all the way. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're just meant to find the pieces that make it hurt a little less." The firelight flickered across their faces. Two people bound not by romance yet, but by shared wounds and the fragile courage it took to speak them aloud. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the first hint of dawn glowed faintly through the cracks in the barn wall. Chance stirred and lifted his head, nickering softly, alive, strong, whole. Luke met Clara's gaze, his voice low. "Seems he's learning to stand again." She smiled, tears glistening on her lashes. "Maybe we all are." And as the first light of morning crept over Hollow Ridge, it wasn't just the Colt who'd survived the storm. It was two lonely hearts, beginning to find their way back to warmth. The next morning dawned cool and still, as if the storm had scoured every sound from the land. The valley shimmered with dew. The grass bowed under its weight. Clara stood at the fence line, her arm still wrapped but healing, watching Chance trot freely for the first time. The Colt's strength had returned, his spirit unbroken. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt the same, unshackled. The fear that had clung to her since leaving her old life had begun to loosen. With Luke, she had found something rare, peace. But peace, she soon learned, is fragile. That afternoon, as she and Luke worked side by side in the corral, the faint sound of hooves rose on the wind. Not the familiar rhythm of Luke's cattle horses, but the heavier tread of travelers. Luke looked up, his expression tightening. Dust rose along the road, two riders approaching fast. Clara's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew that gait. That arrogance. Nathan, she breathed. Luke turned to her sharply. The man from the letter? She nodded, pale. He's come. Luke's jaw hardened. Stay here, but she shook her head. No, I won't hide from him again. Moments later, the riders came to a stop in the yard. Nathan Hale, immaculate even in the dust, and a hired hand whose hand rested ominously on the butt of his revolver. Nathan dismounted smoothly, his smile practiced and cold. Clara, he said, as though greeting an old friend, I've been searching for you everywhere. You left so suddenly and with something that belongs to me. Her hands clenched into fists, nothing that ever belonged to you. Luke stepped between them, his presence quiet but commanding. You're trespassing, mister. Best say your piece and ride on. Nathan's smile faltered, replaced by disdain. And you are? Luke McAllister, he said evenly. Owner of this ranch. And the man who decides who's welcome on it. Nathan gave a short, humorless laugh. Ah, the rescuer. I should have guessed. His gaze slid back to Clara. You always did have a weakness for strays and saviors. But I'm not here to fight, darling. Just to collect what's mine. The deed your father left. You've been carrying it around like a guilty conscience. Luke's eyes flicked toward Clara. She drew in a shaky breath. The deed is mine. My father left the ranch to me. You forged my name on the sale papers. Nathan's expression hardened. That's a dangerous accusation. It's the truth, she said, voice trembling but clear. And I can prove it. The real deed's in my satchel, the one you never managed to steal. Luke stepped closer to her, his voice low but fierce. You don't owe this man anything, Nathan sneered. You think this cowboy can protect you from the law? From me? But something in Luke's stillness, that quiet iron steadiness, made even Nathan hesitate. Luke didn't reach for his gun, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, You'll leave this valley now or you'll find out just how serious I can get about what's mine to protect. Clara's breath hitched. What's mine to protect? Nathan's smirk faltered and he gave a sharp whistle. His hired man shifted uneasily, reading Luke's tone, the tension in the air. This isn't over, Nathan spat. You'll regret this. Doubt it, Luke said flatly. They turned and rode off, the sound of hooves fading down the ridge until only silence remained. Clara stood trembling, staring after them. Her body was taut with fear and relief. He'll come back, she whispered. Luke turned to her, resting a hand on her shoulder, solid, grounding. Then he'll find we're ready. Tears filled her eyes, and not of weakness but of release. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she hadn't run. She'd faced the man who broke her, and she wasn't alone. Luke's voice softened. You did good, Clara, stood your ground. She met his gaze, her voice unsteady but strong. I couldn't have done it without you. His thumb brushed her cheek, slow and sure. You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to. The wind rustled the fields around them, carrying the scent of sage and rain. The worst of her past had ridden away, and though the dust hadn't yet settled, something inside Clara finally had. The days that followed Nathan's departure felt like a new dawn for both Clara and Luke. The ranch was quiet again, filled only with the lowing of cattle, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, and the easy laughter that had begun to slip back into their days. Chance. The once broken Colt had become a symbol of something greater, of survival, of healing, of trust. Every morning Clara would ride out with Luke to the far pasture, and together they'd watch the young horse run, mane streaming like wildfire, hooves pounding against the earth that once seemed too hard to hold him. He's different, Clara said softly one morning. It's like he finally knows he's safe. Luke's eyes were on her, not the Colt. Maybe he finally knows he's loved. She looked away, heat rising in her cheeks. You always know just what to say, don't you, Luke McAllister? He gave a half smile. Only when I mean it. The silence that followed was warm and full, not awkward, not uncertain. Just real. They'd been through storms together, both the kind that darkened the sky and the ones that raged inside. And somehow, through it all, they'd come out stronger. Still, there were things Clara hadn't said, fears she still carried like shadows in her chest. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the hills, she found the courage. Luke, she said, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. When Nathan came, part of me wanted to run again. I've spent so long believing I didn't belong anywhere, that I was too much trouble, Too much hurt. Luke set down the pail he'd been carrying and turned to face her. The setting sun painted his features in soft amber. You're not trouble, Clara. You're the reason this place feels alive again. She blinked rapidly, caught between disbelief and hope. You don't mean that. I do, he said, stepping closer. You and that Colt, both of you came here scared, half-starved, near broken. And look at you now. You both got fire again. You brought it back for me, too. His words wrapped around her heart like a gentle bandage. Firm, sure, healing. She felt the tears before she could stop them. You're the only man who ever made me feel like I was worth saving. He smiled faintly. You were never the one who needed saving. Clara, you just needed someone to remind you how strong you are. A soft wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of fresh hay and the faint sound of Chance neighing in the distance. Luke took her hand, rough and warm, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. I don't want you to leave when winter comes, he said quietly. I've seen what this place is like without you, and I don't much care for it. Her breath caught. Are you saying? He nodded, his voice low and certain. I'm saying stay. With me. With us. This ranch isn't much, but it's honest. And it's home. If you'll have it. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The woman who had once fled with nothing but a dying Colt and a letter could hardly believe what she'd found. Not just safety, but belonging. Love, slow and quiet, like the dawn over the prairie. She squeezed his hand. Then I guess I'm home. Luke's smile deepened, soft as sunlight through the clouds. He leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and unhurried, a promise rather than a possession. As the day faded, Chance galloped along the fence line, his powerful stride echoing across the land. Clara rested her head against Luke's shoulder, watching the Colt's wild grace. He's free, she whispered. So are you, Luke murmured back. And under the wide, forgiving sky, the woman, the cowboy, and the Colt, each once broken in their own way, stood whole again,